Trump's indictment is tragic for our country but an imperative for justice. From the moment Donald Trump left office under the cloud of an insurrection he inspired, two questions troubled the American conscience. The first, asked urgently by Trump's opponents, was rooted in the imperative of equal justice. Shouldn't a former president be held accountable for breaking the law, as any other citizen would be? The second, popular among Trump's supporters but also resonant with some of his historically minded critics, how could the Justice Department of a new administration move to indict President Biden's 2020 opponent, and potential future challenger, without damaging democratic norms? Down the path of resisting charges against presidential criminality lay lawlessness, the death of accountability and a culture of impunity for the powerful. But, ask the doubters, should we not worry that bringing a political opponent to justice might encourage a cycle of recrimination, an ongoing tit-for-tat use of prosecutorial power against political adversaries? On Thursday, accountability overcame fear. In bringing the first federal charges ever against a former president, the Justice Department made the less political decision. Special counsel Jack Smith focused solely on the facts of the documents case, on the law and on what Trump allegedly did. "We have one set of laws in this country," Smith said at a brief Friday news conference, "and they apply to everyone." In a devastating 49-page indictment, Smith detailed Trump's deceptions, carelessness and willingness to save his hide by destroying or hiding documents, even from his attorneys, in, among other places, a shower in a bathroom. It was the correct, sober and courageous call, but Trump's apologists immediately cried foul. Never mind that many who denounced the Justice Department had reveled in cries of "lock her up" when Hillary Clinton was Trump's 2016 opponent. Never mind that Trump himself had argued that Clinton's mishandling of government documents disqualifies her from the presidency and pledged to enforce all laws concerning the protection of classified information. In an outrageous but unsurprising declaration, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy declared it unconscionable for a president to indict the leading candidate opposing him. No. Biden did not bring this indictment. A grand jury did. In one of many ironies of the case, Attorney General Merrick Garland seemed, if anything, a reluctant warrior, plainly anxious about the long-term implications of indicting the former president. He came under fire from some in his own party for moving too slowly against Trump. He did all he could to insulate the investigation from politics, appointing Smith, a political independent, as special counsel and leaving all decisions to him. Biden stayed far away. The idea that only authoritarian regimes and weak democracies bring charges against former leaders is also mistaken. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, for example, was sentenced in 2021 to a year in prison for corruption and influence peddling. Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is on trial on bribery, fraud and breach of trust charges. And Richard Nixon was in sufficient danger of indictment after Watergate that President Gerald Ford, whom Nixon had chosen as his vice president, preemptively pardoned him of all potential crimes. "My conscience tells me clearly and certainly that I cannot prolong the bad dreams that continue to reopen a chapter that is closed," Ford said, justifying a choice that is controversial to this day. Many of the lieutenants Nixon commissioned in the Watergate break-in and the subsequent cover-up were put on trial and jailed. Nixon was not. Otherwise, he, not Trump, could have been the first former president to face charges. And there is one major difference: the Trump chapter is decidedly not closed. The former president is the front-runner for the 2024 Republican presidential nomination. The parallel investigations of Trump have prompted another question: is the documents case built around obstruction of justice and violations of the Espionage Act somehow less serious than charges of fomenting an insurrection and trying to overthrow a free election? It is the wrong question, and not just because the law is the law. In fact, Trump's intrigues around classified material bring home so many aspects of what has made his public life so odious: his belief that the rules do not apply to him, his propensity for lying, his disrespect for the responsibilities of a president, his treatment of office as a private possession, and his view of foreign policy, and everything else, as a transactional drama revolving solely around himself. Smith's decision to bring charges challenges Trump on all these fronts. But our nation is at this tragic point in its history not because of Smith or Garland. It is rooted in a much earlier choice. Trump has told us who he is throughout his life. The content of his character was obvious the moment he announced his presidential candidacy and brought into even sharper relief during the 2016 campaign. We got to this point because of the workings of our electoral system and because 62,984,828 Americans were willing to take a chance on him even though many of them knew he was flawed. Those flaws have come back to haunt him, and us. Trump's indictment is tragic for our country but an imperative for justice. From the moment Donald Trump left office under the cloud of an insurrection he inspired, two questions troubled the American conscience. The first, asked urgently by Trump's opponents, was rooted in the imperative of equal justice: shouldn't a former president be held accountable for breaking the law, as any other citizen would be? The second, popular among Trump's supporters but what if Putin loses his war in Ukraine? Victory over Russia would recast Europe's politics as well as the US-China rivalry. Nobody this side of paradise knows how Vladimir Putin's war will end, but Zbigniew Brzezinski identified the stakes in 1994. Without Ukraine, he wrote in Foreign Affairs, Russia ceases to be an empire. Mr. Putin couldn't agree more, and for him and the Russian nationalists clinging to his coattails, Russia is an empire or it is nothing at all. A Ukrainian victory, which we can describe as an end to the conflict that leaves Ukraine with all or most of its original territory, independent of Moscow and aligned with the West, would be a geopolitical earthquake. The Russia that Europe has known and feared since the 18th century, an immense and looming presence relentlessly bent on expanding westward, will be gone. The consequences would reshape the politics of Europe and the Middle East and define a new era in US-China competition. Many in the West hoped that the fall of the Soviet Union would have ended the threat of Russian imperialism, but Mr. Putin's regime was bent on defying the odds. After all, Tsarist Russia collapsed in World War I and the Communists had to sign the punitive Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Imperial Germany, giving up swathes of land and acknowledging the independence of former imperial territories, including Ukraine. Taking advantage of Western divisions and weakness, Lenin reassembled almost the entire empire of Nicholas II, and Stalin seized still more territory to make Moscow a global superpower. Mr. Putin wants to follow in those footsteps, but he doesn't covet only Ukrainian territory. He wants Ukraine's DNA. Russia faces one of the greatest demographic challenges of any country in the world. After peaking in 1992, the population of the Russian Federation declined by roughly 5 million through 2021. Worse, from Mr. Putin's viewpoint, despite substantial immigration by ethnic Russians from newly independent ex-Soviet republics in Central Asia, the ethnically Russian population is in free fall, diminishing by 5.4 million between 2010 and 2021. During those years the percentage